Okay, so I'm going to discuss, so did the universe have a beginning? Was it created? Will it have an end? And I may say something about whether it has a purpose that can be seen by science. So I'm going to discuss these questions both from the point of view of traditional Catholic teaching and from the point of view of modern physics and cosmology. So let's start at the beginning of the universe. For Christian doctrine, for Catholic doctrine, the fundamental text about the beginning of the universe is the first verse of the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, this verse asserts both that the universe is created by God and that it had a beginning in time. It's very important, I think, to recognize that these are two logically distinct ideas, even though they're tied together by this scriptural verse. Creation refers to the fact that the universe depends for its existence upon God, who is the source of its being. Beginning refers to the universe having a temporal starting point rather than having a history that stretches back infinitely into the past or that goes around in a loop. The Catechism of the Catholic Church, in explaining Genesis 1:1, quite properly treats beginning and creation as distinct components of its meaning. In section 290, the Catechism says, "Three things are affirmed in these first words of Scripture. The eternal God gave a beginning to all things that exist outside of himself. He alone is creator, and the totality of what exists, expressed by the formula, the heavens and the earth, depends on the one who gives it being." Now, although being created and having a temporal beginning are distinct ideas, many theologians, philosophers, and ordinary people have seen them as connected in a necessary way. For example, some religious people see the presumed fact that the universe had a temporal beginning as proving that the universe was created. And some people refer to the Big Bang as the moment of creation. You actually even find that in some old science books, though they tend not to say that kind of thing today. For their part, many atheists think that if you could show that the universe didn't have a temporal beginning, but always existed, and for some reason didn't have a first moment, it would disprove the need for a creator. It would show there was no creation. Now, in my view, both, which has to do with its internal sequential structure and its origin. I hope I have been not, so I have to say start at the beginning? Okay. And so one can distinguish the beginning or opening of something which has to do with its internal sequential structure and the origin in the sense of the ultimate cause of its existence. If someone were to ask why a certain novel exists, it would be silly to point to its first words. Rather, one would point to its author. In fact, there could be a novel whose plot went around in a circle, and which was even printed on a scroll that looped around on itself, so that it had no first words. It would have no beginning, but it would still have to have an author. In a similar way, if you ask why the universe exists, it would be silly to point to the Big Bang or whatever its first events were. Rather, one should point to the mind of its divine author. And even a universe that was cyclical, for example, and had no first events, or one that stretched infinitely into the past, would still require an author. Divine creation in Catholic teaching is the act by which God confers being upon the universe and all that it contains. As St. Thomas Aquinas put it, God is to all things the cause of being. God's creative act is the reason that the universe is a real universe, one that actually exists, rather than just a possible, fictitious, or hypothetical universe. Creation is the conferring of reality. It follows that God equally creates all things and events whenever and wherever they are located within the internal spatio-temporal structure of the universe. God is the source of being of this cup of water right here and now because it's real. It has being, and God is making it real. This is analogous to the fact that a composer is equally the source of every note of his or her symphony, and that a novelist is equally the source of every word of his or her novel. God's creative act, therefore, is not something that happened once upon a time, a long time ago. Because it is an act of the divine mind, God's creative act, his act of creating the world, has no location in space and time. It's a single, eternal, timeless act by which God wills the existence of the whole universe and all of its parts from beginning to end. God is therefore the creator of what is happening here and now, just as much as he is the creator of what happened 13.8 billion years ago, or what will happen billions of years hence. Now, admittedly, Genesis 1:1 speaks of God creating in the beginning. And theological tradition also distinguishes God's act of creating in the beginning from his act of conserving things in existence later. But Catholic tradition also says that this distinction is only verbal. It's not rather than real. According to Catholic theology, God's creating and his conserving are really one and the same eternal act. So what I've said up to this point is the traditional Catholic understanding of divine creation. And so you can see from it that physics can have nothing to say about the creation of the universe, God's giving it being and reality. Even though physics may be able to tell us whether the universe had a temporal beginning and about the physical events that happened at or near that temporal beginning. Now, some religious people have the notion that the events at the temporal beginning of the universe must have been miraculous in the sense that they cannot be described by science or that they violated the laws of physics. Now, this notion may be in part due to the fact that cosmologists often speak of the universe having an initial singularity. And have you heard of the people speak of the singularity at the beginning of the universe? Now, if one attempts to describe the evolution, now what does that mean? If you attempt to describe the evolution of the universe at its earliest moments using Einstein's theory of gravity, but ignoring quantum mechanics, leaving that out, what you find is there must be a first instant of time at which various physical quantities must have been infinite at that first moment, including the density of energy and the curvature of space-time, more precisely, the Riemannian curvature of space-time. You know, as you go back in the history of the universe is getting smaller and smaller as you go back, more and more compressed, more and more hot and dense. And as you get back towards the Big Bang, it's inconceivably hot and dense. And at that first instant, let's call it t = 0, it would be infinitely hot and dense, and that's called a singularity. One meaning of the word singularity in mathematics and physics is a point at which something becomes infinite. Now, because of these mathematical infinities at t equals 0, the laws of physics would break down at that point. You wouldn't be able to, at that so-called singularity, you would not be able to apply the equations of physics there, because essentially you'd be dividing by 0, just like that's not allowed. You can't, 1 divided by 0, well, loosely you can say that's infinity, but really you shouldn't be applying, you shouldn't be dividing by 0. You shouldn't be trying to do that. And so that's the initial singularity, as it's called. However, it is known that it is not valid to do what I just described, which is to use Einstein's theory of gravity to describe the early moments of the universe and leave quantum mechanics out of account, to leave that aside. Because at that those very early times, when things were so dense and hot, we know that quantum mechanics would become extremely important at that point. And so, and you have to use it, take it into account to do the calculations properly. Now, most fundamental physicists expect, for good reasons, for good physics reasons, that if you were able to do, no one knows how to apply quantum mechanics and Einstein's theory of gravity at the same time at the beginning of the universe. People don't have a good enough understanding of quantum mechanics, how to put quantum mechanics and gravity together to do those calculations. But there are good physics reasons for suspecting that if you could do the calculation correctly, you would find that there was no singularity, or that at least there was that no physical quantities that would become infinite. There would be no point at t equals 0 at which physical things became infinite. And in fact, most physicists and fundamental physicists believe or suspect that the laws of physics would be found to apply, the equations would be found to apply there, just as everywhere else. So there would be no physical singularity. Now, and so, as I said, so the laws of physics, it is thought, and no one knows because we don't know how to do those calculations, but it is thought that the laws of physics should apply at the beginning as well as everywhere else. Now, as far as theology goes, there's no reason, so in that sense, the beginning was a natural process. Natural in that it followed and obeyed the laws of nature. Now, as far as theology goes, there's no reason to expect otherwise. Just as you'd expect the first sentence of a novel, the first words of a novel, to obey the same laws of grammar and syntax as all the later sentences of the novel, you'd expect the events at the beginning of the universe to obey the same physical laws as the later events. And it would be absurd for someone to suggest of a book that if the laws of grammar apply at the beginning of the book, that means it has no author. No, there's nothing to do with that. Of course, it still needs an author. And it's similarly, it would be absurd for someone to suggest that if the laws of physics apply or applied at the beginning of the universe, that it somehow means the universe didn't have to have an author. That doesn't follow at all. Okay. And so get out of your mind the idea that the beginning of the universe was miraculous in the sense of violating the laws of physics or something, or that the events at the beginning of the universe can't be described, would not be describable by physics. And yet, many atheists make the argument that if the universe's beginning was natural and obeyed the laws of physics, that somehow that would mean there's no God. That is an argument, for example, that the late Stephen Hawking made towards the end of his life. He suggested that the full equations of physics, which would include quantum gravity, would both require, first of all, he said, if we knew the full laws of physics, we would find that they require the universe to have a beginning, and also would adequately describe what happened at the beginning. And I think that's perfectly reasonable. I would agree with him on that. I think but he went on to assert that this would somehow render a creator superfluous. Now, the first thing that needs to be said about this is that Hawking was making the very mistake we've been talking about, namely confusing creation and beginning. But there's another reply, and strangely enough, it was given by a physicist, well, it was given by a physicist just as great as Hawking. And you know who that physicist was? It was Hawking. Hawking himself explained why, gave the answer to that many years earlier. In his 1988 bestseller, A Brief History of Time, Hawking noted, do I have that up here? Yes. Hawking noted that a theory of physics is, quote, just a set of rules and equations. And then he went on to ask, what is it that breathes fire into the equations and makes a universe for them to describe? The usual approach of science of constructing a mathematical model cannot answer the question of why there should be a universe for the model to describe. The point that he's making here, can perhaps be made clear by another simple analogy. You can have a book that contains the rules of a game, let's say baseball. Those rules, that rule book, describe the various kinds of things that can happen in a baseball game, how they happen, under what circumstances, how one thing causes another within the baseball game, and so on. These rules even describe how baseball games begin and how they end. But those rules in no way tell you whether any actual game of baseball is being played, will ever be played, or has ever been played. The rules could be describing merely hypothetical or fictitious games or possible games. A mere set of rules does not have the power to make real the events they're describing. And so just as the rules of baseball describe how a baseball game would begin, but do not cause there to be any real baseball games, so too the rules of a possible kind of universe, the mathematical equations that would describe one, or that would govern one, may describe how a universe of that type would begin, but could not cause there to be a real universe of that type. The laws of physics have no power to create universes in the sense of giving reality to them, any more than the rules of baseball can make a real baseball game. So physics itself, which is, as he said, just a set of rules, physics itself cannot answer the question of why there is an actual real universe for the laws of physics to describe. God may be the answer, and that's the Christian and the theistic answer. Why is the universe real? Why is there a real universe? God. God is the cause of being, as St. Thomas said. He is the giver of being. So God may be the answer. So why is there a real universe? God may be the answer. Or maybe there's no answer, as atheists have traditionally held. It's just, there is a universe. There's no reason why. There's no cause. It just is, brute fact. But physics is certainly not the answer. So you can choose between God and atheism, saying God's the answer, no answer, but physics is certainly not the answer. And that's something that Hawking, when he was younger, understood. So that's all I'm going to say about creation. So now let's turn to the distinct question of whether the universe did have a temporal beginning or was, as some people say, past infinite. Has it always been here? Has there always been a universe for infinite time? What does Christian revelation say? What can philosophy or pure reason tell us? And what does empirical science tell us? That is physics and cosmology. Now, revelation, divine revelation, in particular Genesis 1:1, refers to a beginning, and Christians have always taken this to imply that the universe had a temporal beginning. Now, some pagans in antiquity mocked this idea. Ancient pagan philosophers, including Aristotle, believed that the universe had always existed for infinite time, no beginning. St. Augustine, in his Confessions, tells us that some pagans would ask Christians, and what was your God? Because they didn't believe in a creation or a beginning. And so they would ask Christians, what was your God doing for all that infinite time before he finally got around to making the world just a finite time ago? Why did he wait infinitely long before creating the universe? And what was he doing? Was he twiddling his thumbs for infinite time and then suddenly decided to create the universe? Now, St. Augustine gave a very profound and very famous answer to this question in the 11th book of his Confessions. So that was the pagan taunt. And St. Augustine's reply was this. He pointed out that time is a measure of change, and therefore presupposes the existence of things that are changing, of changeable things, and therefore of created things. So if there's time, if time is passing, you must have some created, changeable things around. Therefore, time is a feature or aspect of the created world and is therefore itself something created. Time itself is created. So if time is passing, and as I said, something created must already exist, and creation must therefore have already taken place. It's therefore nonsensical. So all times that pass are after creation. It's therefore nonsensical to speak. It's simply a contradiction in terms to even speak about a time before creation. So St. Augustine answered the pagan taunt in these words. But if there was no time before heaven and earth, why do they ask what you, O Lord, did then? There was no then where there was no time. In other words, the beginning of the created world was also the beginning of time itself. While others had spoken of a beginning of time, a few other people, I know of one, Philo of Alexandria, but there may have been others, it seems that St. Augustine was the first person to understand and articulate this concept clearly, that time itself has a beginning. It's not just that the universe started a finite time ago. Time began at the same point a finite time ago. Now, modern physics came to the same concept 15 centuries later by a parallel route. St. Augustine had started with the insight that time is something created, whereas modern physics started with the insight coming from Einstein's theory of gravity general relativity, as it's called, that time is something physical, or at least the time that physicists and that we can measure, physical time, is something physical. And that if the universe had a beginning, if the physical universe had a beginning, that must mean that physical time also had a beginning. So that's, physicists caught up with that idea in the beginning of the 20th century, near the beginning of the 20th century. Just as St. Augustine profoundly realized that it makes no sense to speak of a time before creation, when God might be sitting around doing nothing, modern physics says that it makes no sense to speak of a time before the universe began. So if, say, the universe began 13.8 billion years ago, then it would be meaningless to speak of 20 billion years ago. There would be no such time. The notion of the beginning of time is now enshrined in Christian doctrine. Both the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 and the First Vatican Council in 1870 taught that God created the universe ab initio temporis, that is, from the beginning of time. Now, St. Augustine's insights have an important corollary. God, in his divine nature, not talking about the human nature assumed in the incarnation, but God in his divine nature is non-temporal, atemporal. If time is something created by God, then temporal categories cannot apply to the divine nature. God dwells in an eternal, meaning timeless, present. In St. Augustine's words, God dwells in the sublimity of an ever-present eternity. St. Thomas spoke of God dwelling in the nunc stans, the now that stands still. This, of course, fits well with the perspective afforded us by modern physics. If space-time is the fabric, if space-time is the fabric of the physical world, as general relativity tells us, then the divine nature could not be temporal without also being spatial and physical, a notion that has always been rejected by Christian tradition as absurd. God is not physical. He's not spatial. He's not temporal. Now, so we've seen a Christian doctrine based on divine revelation arrived at the conclusion that from Genesis 1:1, arrived at the conclusion that the universe has a temporal beginning, and also that beginning is the beginning of time itself. What can reason alone, unaided by divine revelation, say about the question? In particular, what does philosophy say? Well, a very important Christian philosopher, St. Thomas Aquinas, said that there's no compelling philosophical argument, at least, he said, none that he was aware of, that proved that the universe had a temporal beginning. He did think that one could prove philosophically that the universe is created, that it depends upon God for its existence. He built that we can discover just by using our reason, even without divine revelation. We can, by reason, come to understand that the universe depends upon God for its existence. But he said that it was within God's power to create a universe that's past infinite or one that has a finite past. He could have done it either way. We only know by revelation, he said, by divine revelation, that God chose to create a universe that has a temporal beginning. Now, some other philosophers have claimed, contrary to St. Thomas, that it is demonstrable by reason alone that the universe had a temporal beginning. This is claimed, for example, by the proponents of the so-called Kalam argument for the existence of God, the most well-known proponent of which, perhaps, is the Protestant philosopher and apologist William Lane Craig. The Kalam argument, the Kalam is an Arabic word. It's an argument that was developed by Muslim philosophers back, I think, in maybe it was the 13th century, I don't know, about 1,000 years ago. The Kalam argument purports to show that the following: philosophically, just by reason, A, the universe must have had a temporal beginning, so they think they can prove that philosophically. B, any entity which has a temporal beginning which has started at some point to be, must have a cause outside of itself, a reason why it came to be, and that, in the case of the universe, is God. Several medieval Christian philosophers also believed that the finite age of the universe can be proved philosophically. So that was St. Thomas's view. Philosophy without the aid of revelation can prove that the universe is created, but there are no compelling philosophical proofs that the universe had a temporal beginning. Okay, but some are philosophers. So some philosophers, the Christian philosophers, theologians, in the Middle Ages, St. Bonaventure, for example, believe that you can prove philosophically that the universe had a beginning. A notable example is so how did St. Bonaventure make? He had several arguments to this effect. One argument he made was the following. Suppose, St. Bonaventure said, suppose the universe was infinitely old. Well, if it were infinitely old, and so up here is a succession of days. D stands for days. There's a succession of days, and that one I made in red is today. And that succession of days goes, let's suppose, infinitely far in the past. Well, then he said, if that's the case, there must be some day, and that's that other red day, there must be some day that's infinitely far from us in the past, that's infinitely remote from now. Now, consider that infinitely remote past day. The day after it would also be infinitely in our past. And the day after that would still be, because infinity minus 1 is still infinity. And the day after that is still infinitely in the past, and so on. And every successive day would still be infinitely far from us, which means the passage of days would never get to now, which means those are not really in our past. Very interesting argument, but utterly fallacious. And the fallacy is this, and today this is obvious, to a mathematician anyway. You can have an infinite succession of days going into the past without where every particular past day is a finite number of days ago. It sounds paradoxical. How can you have an infinite succession of days into the past, but every single one of them is a finite number of days into the past? Well, think of the whole numbers, the counting numbers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. That sequence goes forever. It's an infinite sequence. But every specific number in that sequence is finite. There's no infinite number there. Every number is finite, and yet there's an infinite number of them. So there's nothing contradictory. So that's a fallacious argument. If there's an infinite past, every day would be finite time into the past, and yet there would be no beginning to them. So that doesn't work. He had another argument. He had several other arguments, so I won't go into them. Now, St. Thomas was aware of this. He was a contemporary of St. Bonaventure, and he was not convinced. St. Thomas thought that these arguments were fallacious, and he was right. I guess score one for the Dominicans over the Franciscans. I mean, from the point of view of modern mathematics, or a modern mathematician or physicist would not see any force to these arguments for St. Bonaventure. Anyway, so I agree with St. Thomas that just by reasoning alone, you can't prove the universe has a finite age. Just by pure reason, it's a possibility that it's infinitely old. What about science? Now, until modern times, science was not in a position to say anything on this question. By the late 19th century, however, several discoveries had been made that seemed to bear upon the question of whether the universe had a finite or an infinite past. Most of those discoveries seemed to go against the idea of a cosmic beginning. In Newtonian physics, for example, it seemed natural to suppose that time stretched infinitely into the past and into the future, just as space was supposed to stretch infinitely far in all directions. Moreover, in the middle of the 19th century, physicists discovered the law of conservation of energy, which said that energy cannot be created or destroyed, but only changed from one form to another. And chemists discovered in the 19th century that atoms are never created or destroyed in chemical reactions. So it began to appear that matter, energy, space, and time had always existed and always would. In 1911, the Nobel Prize-winning chemist Svante Arrhenius said, "The opinion that something can come from nothing is at variance with the present-day state of science, according to which matter is immutable." You can't make matter or destroy matter. It's immutable, and therefore it must always have existed and must always continue to exist. That's what he was arguing. The Nobel Prize-winning physicist Walter Nernst declared that, quote, "to deny the infinite duration of time," and he meant both into the past and into the future, "would be to betray the very foundations of science." Now, of course, it was realized back then that the Earth must have had a beginning, because the Earth's interior was still hot, is still hot, and it would have cooled off had it been infinitely old. And some scientists back then, in the 19th century, late 19th century, used what's called the second law of thermodynamics, which I'll mention later, if I have time, to argue that the universe itself must have had a beginning. But it was hard to make scientific sense of that idea of a cosmic beginning, and the view began to prevail among scientists, at least those who were not religious, that the universe had always existed, and you can see that from these quotes. That began to be the prevailing view. As late as the 1950s, a survey of American astronomers in the 1950s showed the majority believed that the universe had no beginning. The idea of a temporal beginning of the universe came to seem like a relic of religious mythology and contrary to modern science. But thinking on the subject took a dramatic turn early in the 20th century. It started with Einstein's theory of gravity, called general relativity, which was published in 1915. In Einstein's theory, space and time form a four-dimensional manifold, which one can think of as a physical fabric that can bend and ripple in response to the matter and energy that fill it. In the 1920s, a Russian mathematician named Alexander Friedmann and a Belgian theoretical physicist named Georges Lemaitre, who was also a Catholic priest, as I mentioned yesterday, showed independently of each other that the equations of Einstein's theory of gravity could describe a universe that is expanding. That is not just a universe in which matter is moving apart from other matter, in which matter is expanding, but a universe in which space itself is stretching to make the universe larger. Lemaitre was aware, now Friedmann died in the 1920s, died at a young age, and so he left the picture. Lemaitre was aware of astronomical observations in the 1920s that showed that distant galaxies are receding from us very rapidly. And on the basis of those observations, performed by people like Slipher and Hubble, and his own theoretical calculations based on Einstein's theory of gravity, he proposed that the universe is indeed expanding from an initial explosion, which he called the primeval atom, and which is now called the Big Bang. So he is the founder, the proposer of the Big Bang theory. Now, in the 1960s, cosmic radiation left over from that explosion was discovered by Arno Penzias and Robert W. Wilson. And since then, evidence for the Big Bang has accumulated rapidly. there's now no doubt among fundamental physicists and cosmologists that there was a Big Bang 13 billion years ago, 13.8 billion years ago. Now, in the standard model of cosmology, the Big Bang is assumed to be, as I said, the beginning of the universe and thus of matter, space, and time itself. That does not, however, resolve the question definitively, because there are many speculative extensions of the standard model of cosmology that have been proposed. And in some of these scenarios, as we call them, they're not yet testable theories, they're scenarios. The Big Bang was not the beginning of the universe, but rather one event in a history that stretches back further. Some of the more important speculative scenarios in which the universe had a pre-Big Bang history are called the bouncing universe, the ekpyrotic universe, and eternal inflation. I should say that my field of research, I'm retired now from research, but for 40 plus years, is primarily theoretical particle physics, but that includes cosmology of the early universe. Many, if not most, theoretical particle physicists also do research in early universe cosmology. And so I've written a lot of papers on some of these things myself. Now, in the bouncing universe scenario, the universe is supposed to be undergoing an endless cycle of expansion and contraction. So it expands from some highly dense, compressed state. It expands, reaches a maximum size, and then recollapses. Now, what is assumed to be, what most people think probably would happen in that case is the universe would collapse into what's called the Big Crunch, and that would be the end of the universe, end of time. So like the mirror image of the beginning. Big Bang, collapse to a big crunch, end of story. The curtain drops. But you can imagine, and there's no physics reason to suppose that this would actually happen, you can imagine instead of that being the end, it would bounce and start expanding again, and then recollapse and bounce and expand. And you can imagine the cycle of expansion and contraction going forever in the future and having gone on forever in the past. Einstein played around with this notion in 1930, and he was trying to sort of preserve the idea of a universe that had been in existence forever, even though he had come to think that it had there was a Big Bang. However, a physicist named Richard Tolman showed that even in such a scenario, there almost certainly had to be a first bounce. It had to be a first expansion. And the reason is that in the bouncing universe scenario, you can show that the bounces get longer and longer. With each bounce, the universe gets hotter and hotter, and the bounces get longer, and there's more pressure because it's hotter, and therefore the bounces, they'll take longer. Which means, conversely, as you go back in the past, the bounces were shorter and shorter, and in such a way that even though there might have been, that there would be only be a finite number of them, okay? And so actually, the universe, even in a bouncing universe scenario, probably had to have a beginning. And there's other scenarios I won't talk about. Well, one is called the ekpyrotic universe. That's a very exotic thing. It has a fancy name they gave it. But what it is, that's based on the idea that there are two universes, three-dimensional universes, and that they're separated. They're parallel universes, and they're separated by a fourth space dimension, and that they bounce or oscillate in that fourth dimension. And it turns, and you can suppose that that's been going on forever. Each universe is expanding in its own three dimensions, always. But in the fourth space dimension, they're doing this, and they crash into each other, and the Big Bang was the latest such crash, but that's been going on forever. So there's all these very wild, interesting, but somewhat wild speculative scenarios. However, and there's another one called eternal inflation, and that's where there's a universe that lasts forever, and within that larger overarching universe, bubble universes form, like bubbles in a boiling pot of water. And the universe, the part of the universe we live in, started we're in one of those bubbles, and the Big Bang was the formation of that bubble. Anyway, but even in such scenarios, there are strong arguments to that don't rigorously prove, but make it seem most probable that the universe as a whole had a beginning a finite time ago. And in one of these arguments is what's the second law of thermodynamics, which I've already alluded to. The second law of thermodynamics is a very fundamental law of physics, and what it says is that entropy, which is a measure of physical disorder, always tends to increase in time as time passes, always increases. This increase of disorder is the reason why everything runs down, wears out, decays. Paper yellows and crumbles, mountains erode, animals and people die. Everything comes to an end because disorder ultimately prevails. And that's why it's impossible to build a perpetual motion machine, as it's called. It's physically impossible to have a machine that runs forever, unless something from outside kind of keeps it going. It will always wear out. It will always eventually run down. And that's a fundamental argument against a universe now being infinitely old. If the universe were infinitely old right now, it essentially would be a perpetual motion machine. Okay, so that's all I'll say about the physics. Now, so whereas 100 years ago, the prevailing view among scientists was that science strongly suggested a universe that had always existed, and the idea of a beginning seemed sort of superstitious or mythological. Now, the prevailing view, and a view that is not proven but is a lot of theoretical arguments in its favor, is the universe does have a temporal beginning, as Christians and Jews always said. Okay. So you can see this as a vindication of Jewish and Christian revelation. All right, and I think I'll stop there. I was going to talk a little bit about how the universe will end, but if people want to know that, ask me later. Okay, so that's where we stand. I don't know. I don't know, except that modern physics strongly... Well, actually, I'll go through it quickly, because I have 5 minutes. I'm going to skip this. Will the universe come to an end? Well, Scripture tells us that it will. In Psalm 102, long ago you laid the foundations of the world, the foundations of the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands. Let me go there. You can read it. Okay. Long ago you laid the foundation of the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish, but you endure. They will all wear out like a garment. That's the second law of thermodynamics. Everything wears out. Even the heavens and the earth, even the heavens. You change them like clothing, and they pass away. Christ himself says, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. St. Paul tells the Corinthians, the present form of this world is passing away. The first letter of John says, and the world and its desires are passing away. The second letter of Peter foretells that the present heavens and earth have been reserved for fire. The heavens will pass away with a loud noise, and the elements will be dissolved with fire. That's Scripture. What does modern cosmology tell us? Well, that's going ahead. Modern cosmology says that the universe will have one of two possible fates. Either the universe will keep expanding forever, and as it expands, it gets emptier and colder, and eventually all the stars will burn out because they'll use up their fuel. Eventually the universe will just approach absolute zero in temperature. It'll be utterly dark, utterly cold, and utterly empty. It'll approach a perfect vacuum and approach absolute zero. That's called the heat death of the universe. And no life would be able to It's called the heat death of the universe because all the heat will be gone. As it expands and gets colder, there will be no heat left. So it sounds a weird way to call it, but it's traditionally called the heat death of the universe. And so there won't be any possibility of life within the universe. The other possibility is the expansion slows down, at some point reverses and becomes a contraction. The universe starts to collapse, and you get the big crunch. Probably that's the end of space and time. And then in that case, also, the universe ends, and there's no life after a certain point. Now, as I said, it's conceivable that that crunch would be a bounce. But as I also said, even if there were an infinite succession of bounces, the universe gets hotter and hotter with each bounce because of the second law of thermodynamics, and eventually also would become incapable of having life in it. So the universe as a place where there's any kind of life will certainly end. As far as the Earth, even if aside from how the fate of the universe, the Earth is certainly going to end as a place where there's life, because in about 5 billion years, astrophysicists tell us, the sun is going to explode and become a red giant and become almost as big as the distance from the Earth to the sun. So it'll come right up, and it'll incinerate anything on the surface of the Earth. So anyway, that's it. Now, it's a little more complicated theologically because the scriptures and tradition also tell us that there will be a new heaven and a new earth. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. Isaiah also tells of God says, I will create a new heavens and a new earth. Anyway, what that will be like, nobody knows. What the new heavens and the new earth are like is not something that we can conceive of. Okay, I won't go into that. That gets beyond what I wanted to talk about. So, okay, that's where I'll stop. So this world's coming to an end. Both scripture and tradition tell us that. And that's an appropriate place to stop. But there will be a new heavens and a new earth, whatever those are. And Scripture tells us we can't conceive of that. It says, what eye has not seen, nor ear heard, or tongue expressed, nor has it entered into the heart of man what God has prepared for those who love him. And so we're told in several ways in Scripture, it's not something we can even conceive of. We shouldn't even try to imagine what it's like. It's beyond our capacity to imagine. And I'll stop there.